Rock stars usually rush from luxury cars to concert venues, never paying attention to the world around them. David Bowie was different. Before his 1987 Madison Square Garden concert, when he noticed a homeless man by the entrance, he threw all protocol out the window. When security said, "Sir, you have a schedule," Bowie replied, "The schedule can wait, that man can't." This response was the most moving thing the crew had ever heard. But the story was just beginning, and David's actions that night would forever change how the entire music world thought about celebrities. If you're listening to this story and want to learn more, please don't forget to subscribe, because the truth David Bowie kept secret that night will reveal the story of one of rock history's most human moments. March 15, 1987, 6 o'clock in the evening. The cold March wind was howling around Madison Square Garden in New York, and this season's merciless cold was making itself felt in every corner of the city. This night, one of the most critical concerts of David Bowie's Glass Spider tour was supposed to be just a musical event. However, when he got out of the black limousine approaching the arena's back entrance, David's eyes met an unexpected scene. Right next to the stage entrance, an elderly man was sitting against the building's cold wall. His worn coat and blanket pieces bore the traces of long days spent on the streets. Next to the man was a small cardboard sign, but David couldn't read the writing from a distance. The security team normally dealt with such situations, taking care not to distract celebrities. But this time something different happened. As David Bowie got out of the limousine, he first started walking toward the arena, then suddenly stopped and turned his head toward where the homeless man was sitting. Security Chief Mike Thompson immediately approached, noticing his sudden stop, and said, "Mr. Bowie, let's go straight to the entrance. We shouldn't stay outside too long." But David's reaction was very different from expected. David's reaction at that moment wasn't random. The economic hardships they experienced during his childhood in Brixton, during his father Hayward Jones's periods of unemployment, had left deep marks on his mind. In the late 1950s, the Jones family had almost faced homelessness due to rent debt. Little David could never forget the nights they stayed temporarily in different houses with the help of neighbors. This experience formed the foundation of David's deep empathy regarding homelessness. Throughout his career, he had supported various charities, especially making regular donations to an organization called Centerpoint that helped homeless youth. But all of this support was done quietly, away from the media. When he saw that man in front of Madison Square Garden, it was as if he was facing the fears from his own past. The man's age was also close to David's father's age during those difficult periods. This similarity had deeply affected him and would lead to his spontaneous decision. David Bowie's concerts were tied to extremely strict schedules: sound check, costume rehearsal, stage work, and backstage organization were events planned down to the minute. The Glass Spider tour was especially famous for its complex stage design, and everything required perfect coordination. The crew knew that David always acted on time and according to his schedule. Therefore, David suddenly stopping and walking toward the homeless man had shocked the entire team. Tour manager James Wilson rushed over and reminded him, "David, sound check starts in 10 minutes. We need to get on stage." But David's response shocked everyone. "James, sound check can wait. This man has probably been waiting here for hours." Security Chief Mike Thompson, understanding the seriousness of the situation, tried to intervene. "Mr. Bowie, I need to remind you of our security protocol. Staying outside too long creates a risk." But David's decision was clear. He walked over to the homeless man and started talking to him. The homeless man's name was Frank Matthews, and he was 67 years old. He was an old Vietnam veteran who had started living on the streets after losing his job due to psychological problems. Frank didn't recognize David, but the sincerity in his approach had put him at ease. David asked his name, wanted to learn where he came from, and listened to Frank's story. According to what Frank told him, he hadn't had a proper meal in 3 days and was looking for a safe place to spend the night. He had chosen the front of Madison Square Garden because it was well lit and had security cameras. At least here no one could harm him. As David listened to Frank's story, his eyes had filled with tears. The fact that a veteran was in this situation had deeply saddened him. At that moment, he made a spontaneous decision and told Frank, "Would you come with me? I can give you a hot meal and a place to rest." Frank was initially suspicious, but David's sincerity had convinced him. David's decision to take Frank backstage created great surprise among the crew. Even James Wilson, a tour manager with 20 years of experience, had never encountered such a situation before. "I didn't understand what David was trying to do," Wilson says years later, "but when I saw his determination, we had to adapt to the situation too." The security team was initially worried. Frank hadn't had a background check done and posed a risk in terms of security protocols. But faced with David's insistent attitude, the team decided to accept Frank within courtesy rules. When Frank was brought backstage, the entire atmosphere had changed. Crew members didn't know how to react to this situation, but David's respect and interest in Frank affected everyone on the team's attitude. David didn't just treat Frank like a guest, he also made him feel valued. David took Frank directly to his own dressing room. This room normally only housed David, his stylist, and the closest team members. But that night Frank was there too, and David was doing everything he could to make him comfortable. First, he had hot coffee and sandwiches brought for Frank. Then he gave him a clean towel and soap to wash up, and even suggested he wear one of his own clean t-shirts. Frank couldn't believe these gestures because no one had shown him such courtesy in years. David continued chatting with Frank while getting dressed. They talked about the Vietnam War, discussed music, and shared memories from Frank's life. David's show of sincerity had greatly affected Frank, and an unexpected bond was beginning to form between the two. Meanwhile, the crew outside was still trying to understand David's behavior. Costume assistant Sarah Mitchell says, "I had seen David nervous before shows dozens of times, but that night he was completely different. He was very peaceful and happy while talking to Frank." Before David went on stage, he had arranged a special place for Frank. A chair for Frank had been placed on the right side of the stage, in the area where the crew stood. From this position, he could both watch the concert and see David up close. Frank had never watched a rock concert before and didn't know David Bowie either, but the hospitality he experienced that night had deeply affected him, and he was beginning to feel great admiration for this artist. Before David went on stage, he came to Frank and said, "If it gets too loud, I can give you earplugs." This thoughtfulness had surprised Frank again. When the concert started with "Up the Hill Backwards," Frank was mesmerized. David's stage performance, his music, and the connection he established with the crowd had completely impressed him. He was watching a rock concert for the first time and experiencing this, and he was shocked by this experience. During his stage performance, David would occasionally look at Frank, checking how he was watching the concert. When he sang Heroes, he looked especially toward Frank and made him feel that he was sharing the meaning of the song with him. This song told the heroic story of people who had overcome difficult situations, and it was very meaningful for Frank. Crew members had noticed a different energy in David's stage performance. That night, David's stage energy was very special, says costume assistant Sarah. It was as if he was taking the stage for a deeper purpose. The motivation that Frank's presence gave David was felt by the entire team. While singing "Let's Dance," David invited Frank to get up and dance. Frank was initially embarrassed, but with the encouragement of the crew members around him, he got up and started accompanying the music. This moment was one of the most emotional moments of that evening. When the concert ended, David came directly to Frank and asked, "How was it? Did you like it?" Frank said with tears in his eyes, "This was the most beautiful experience I've had in my life." But the real surprise David had prepared for him would come later. David had given special instructions to his tour manager. 3 nights accommodation had been arranged for Frank at a nice nearby hotel, and he had also been given $500 in cash. But more importantly, David had contacted a local social services specialist and taken the necessary steps for Frank to find permanent housing and work. Frank couldn't believe these gestures. When he asked, "Why are you being so kind to me?" David simply said, "Because everyone deserves it." This simple but powerful answer deeply affected Frank and everyone there. This story of David's kindness to Frank was deliberately kept secret to prevent it from leaking to the media. None of the crew members leaked this story to the press, and David never mentioned this topic in his interviews. This was interpreted as an indicator of his true character. Tour manager James Wilson says, "David wasn't doing good deeds for the media. He really cared about Frank and didn't want this story to be exploited." This approach was proof of David's authenticity and sincerity. Frank's story only came to light in the 2000s when one of the crew members briefly mentioned it in his memoirs, but it was never told in detail, and David refused to discuss this topic throughout his lifetime. With David's help, Frank's life had completely changed. With the help of the social services specialist, he first started staying in temporary housing, then received mental health support. 3 months later, he found a part-time job and rented a small studio apartment. Years later, Frank told a local newspaper in an interview, "That night was the moment that changed my life. David didn't just help me, he also gave me back my human dignity." Frank's love for David Bowie music continued until the end of his life. In the 1990s, Frank wrote a thank you letter to David, telling him about the positive developments in his life. David found this letter very valuable and kept it in his special file. When Iman found this letter, she learned more about David's secret charitable activities. The crew members who experienced that night had drawn deep inspiration from David's behavior. Tour manager James Wilson started creating special funds for the homeless in subsequent tours and became an example for other artists for similar behaviors. Costume assistant Sarah Mitchell says, "David's treatment of Frank really affected me. After that night, I started volunteering at local homeless shelters too. Many people in the crew had similarly joined social responsibility projects." Security Chief Mike Thompson says, "David showed me what real leadership was that night. I learned that power and fame shouldn't make you forget humanity." This experience had caused Thompson to reconsider security protocols. In the 1980s, many rock stars were turning their charitable activities into media events. Large organizations like Band Aid and Live Aid attracted intense media attention and provided great recognition for celebrities. But David's help to Frank was very different from these. This spontaneous and personal help showed the authenticity in David's character. Without media and publicity, he had acted only with human feelings. This approach was an important feature that distinguished him from other celebrities. Other big names of the period, like Prince and Michael Jackson, were also involved in various aid activities, but usually these were organized campaigns. David's approach to Frank was completely spontaneous and unplanned, which made it more valuable. The experience David had with Frank also showed its effect in his subsequent songs. In the songs he wrote after 1987, social justice and human values began to appear more. The effect was clearly seen in the lyrics of some songs in the Never Let Me Down album, especially in some verses of the Glass Spider song. Themes of social exclusion and loneliness were processed, and the empathy David experienced with Frank was reflected in this creativity. This effect was noticed by music critics, but the real source of the story was unknown. David's producer friends from that period had observed that he approached social issues more sensitively. This change showed itself in his song selections and concert performances. David's son Duncan Jones had learned this story about his father much later. Thanks to Frank's letter that Iman found among David's personal belongings, this story was shared within the family. When Duncan heard this story, his respect for his father increased even more. "My father was always portrayed in the media as someone eccentric and cold," says Duncan, "but in reality he was a very warm-hearted and empathetic person." Frank's story is the best proof of this. This moment played an important role in shaping Duncan's own values. Iman was also surprised when she discovered this side of David, but at the same time she was proud. "As I learned about the good deeds David did secretly, my love for him increased," says Iman. "He was truly a special person." The story David Bowie experienced with Frank is a perfect example of what real stardom is. The humanity shown in moments no one sees is as important as the performance shown under stage lights. The event that took place at Madison Square Garden that March night proves that David had not only musical but also human genius. The respect he showed to a homeless man by ignoring protocol is an indicator of his character depth. This story is still inspiring today because it shows that real greatness lies in using power and fame to not forget humanity. David Bowie changed Frank's life that night, but actually he had added a valuable experience to his own soul too, and this experience took its place in history as his human legacy, separate from his musical legacy.